Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Unpolished Church Podcast. I'm John Sherwood. Thanks so much for joining us. If you wouldn't mind, if you find this podcast helpful, please like and subscribe. Feel free to share it with a friend. Leave a comment below on what you think. Today, I have the very special privilege, and I consider it a blessing, to have a conversation with Dr. Scot McKnight. He is a New Testament scholar and theologian, seminary professor for many, many years, the author of numerous books. Some of them you may be aware of, The Blue Parakeet, Invisible Jesus, Revelation for the Rest of Us, A Church Called Tove, Pivot, The Jesus Creed. Oh my goodness, and on and on and on. A prolific New Testament scholar out of America. And today we're going to be talking about a myriad of topics, everything from celebrity church pastor fallout to toxicity in church cultures, how to navigate creating goodness in church cultures, to American politics and civic engagement from a Christian worldview, and many, many things in between. So I'm excited for you guys to be a part of this episode. Thanks for joining us. Well, thank you so much for joining me here, Dr. Scot McKnight on the Unpolished podcast. It's great to have you.
Well, John, good to be with you, and glad to talk with you about a variety of topics, as I understand it.
Yeah, we're gonna shoot from the hip here, as they say. So first things first, I have to ask: do you prefer me to call you Dr. McKnight? Do you prefer Scott? Do you prefer New Testament scholar for hire? What should I refer to you as?
I prefer Scott, but in the South, I'm called Dr. McKnight, and that's the only place I'm called that.
That's right. Well, obviously, being born and bred in the South and still residing in the South in North Carolina, I understand that culture. And where are you residing right now? Where are you actually talking to us from right now?
We live in the northern suburbs of Chicago.
Okay.
So close to Wisconsin.
Okay. Very good. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me here. I recently have come across your work in a myriad of ways. And by recently, I mean the last several years. But we have a mutual acquaintance and relationship that was at a spiritual formation retreat with you and had a chance to meet you and interact with you. And that relationship actually recommended one of the more recent books in the last couple of years called Pivot, which was a follow-up volume to a book called A Church Called Tove, which I believe made quite a splash in many people's worlds a few years back. But obviously, you've written extensively on many different topics. But recently, you've been writing about this idea of Tove, this Hebrew word there beginning in the early story of Genesis. Maybe we could just start there. Unpack for me a little bit, and for our audience, what is Tove? Why are you writing about it? How did you get engaged into that topic? What gripped you about this narrative? And what have you seen as you've been proclaiming this narrative, this message of Tove and Tove communities? What have you seen in return in terms of people's responses?
Well, at my age, that's a lot of questions to try to remember. So I'll do
Pick one and shoot.
Yeah, that's right. When a story about a major Chicago megachurch broke with the pastor being accused of sexual inappropriateness with several women, I was involved in that church, and my daughter and her husband were in that church, and he was employed at the church. So they had many questions from me about what was going on. And I began to talk to them about, now, look, this is how it usually works out. And is the pastor will deny the allegations. More people will come forward with allegations. The pastor will deny the allegations. More allegations come. And eventually the pastor walks away. That's exactly what happened at Willow Creek with Bill Hybels. And as a result of that, I began to be asked questions, and especially my daughter, she kept pestering me about this. And she kept getting pushed by people at the church. And then, as a seminary professor, my students began asking me questions like, what can I do now so that doesn't happen to me? Well, one of the students who actually asked me that question then ended up in a very similar situation of Bill Hybels, and he's no longer in ministry. This student of mine who was doing a real good job as a pastor, evidently. So I just kept watching the story about Willow Creek, and eventually I wrote a blog post, and one of my points was churches need more goodness. And it really resonated with me when I wrote it. I thought, this is a big idea. And I began talking about it in my seminary classes, and because they're seminary students, I use the Hebrew word because I think it's a cool word, tov. It just means good, or you can translate it as goodness. So I began talking about tov and goodness. And tov is a very popular word on the first page of everybody's Bible, that what God created was good. All that God does is good because God is good. And we sing a song, a lot of churches do, that God is good. And then this word shows up as a master moral category in the Bible over and over and over, hundreds of times. Tov, or good, stands against ra, or evil. So, in Genesis 3, they're told you'd make a choice between tov and ra, and the fall happens because they chose ra. Jesus is called the Good Shepherd. Paul says one of the fruit of the Spirit is tov, or goodness. Now, he's using Greek, agathosune. So it becomes a major category. And one of the major ways I take a look at this is we talk about the gospel. The gospel in Greek, that word gospel in Greek, is a combination of two words, message and good. The Greek word for good is eu, E-U, oo. And it often translates the Hebrew word in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, eu, or oi, however you want to translate it, is a translation of tov. So the gospel is tov news. It is the message that God is good and God has done good for people in redemption, and this redemption makes people learn to do good, and they are transformed into agents of tov in this world. So that became the core idea theologically and biblically for the book, A Church Called Tov. But as a result, what we did in that first book, A Church Called Tov, my daughter, Laura Berenger, and I, was map or list the major elements of a toxic church. Things like narcissism, things like a culture that is motivated by fear rather than grace, institution creep, not telling the truth, called false narratives, focusing on loyalty, focusing on pastors becoming celebrities. And this is a pet peeve of mine, pastors learning to see themselves as leaders rather than spiritual directors. So those were the major categories that we noticed in toxic churches.
Now, you've got to explain, what is institutional creep?
Well, when something happens at a church, let's say an allegation comes forward, some kind of criticism comes forward, a possibility arises that the church could have been wrong in a position it took, or a decision they made, or the way they spend money. The forces are gathered, and everybody begins to defend the institution rather than asking the question, was this person right in what they said? Is what we did wrong? But then institution creep is the institution becomes the all-important category, and it swallows up telling the truth, doing what is right,
Mhm.
and focusing on people first. So
Yeah.
those are things we
Obviously we can all see why I think this resonated with so many people. Obviously over the last decade or two, there has just been, story after story of celebrity pastor fallout and church fallout. And I think even in my own context, as we, have transitioned over the last 5 years into this micro church network model of ecclesiology, and the ways that we have seen the disillusionment, right? The dissatisfaction with the institutional creep, with people feeling like there's got to be something more to this in my faith and in a community of believers than what I see in kind of the predominant traditional expressions of church. And so I can easily connect why this idea of Tov and the toxicity that can happen so easily in us as humans, in organizations, communities as humans, can really resonate for people. And so you had this follow-up called Pivot, which is really like craftily, designed there. It's a Piv Tov. I don't know if that's supposed to be how you say it, but the priorities, practices, and powers that can transform your church into a Tov culture. And you go through in the beginning talking about this follow-up to a church called Tov was born out of people asking you like kind of, as you mentioned, like, how do we actually create Tov cultures? How do we become Tov people? Like, no one's going to readily disagree with, yes, we should be good and we want to be a part of communities and organizations, institutions that are good. But how does that happen? And one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really poignant early in the book is you say that we should be asking whether our churches prioritize character formation or place a higher value on performance. Maybe you can just kind of unpack that a bit more and dive into what is it that you're trying to say there, and why is it that you think character formation is so connected to this idea of goodness, being good, and becoming this goodness of God?
Well, I was asked, and Laura was asked 100 times, what rules can we put in place? What procedures? What can we do when we interview someone? What can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen in our church? And I kept answering the question, the issue here is character. It's not, do you have a set of accountability structures in place?
It's not legislative policy.
That's right. You cannot stop character. You can curb it. You can try to protect it. But you cannot stop a bad character from somehow finding usually his way to what they want to do: create money, have sex, create power, become a celebrity, move on. So I began to talk about character more and more, and then we developed a chapter on this. But character is, let's say, the living embodiment and unity of a person's beliefs, their behaviors, and therefore their disposition. And it becomes an embodied disposition in a direction, with direction. And if it's directed toward Tov, goodness, or virtue, it's a good character. If the direction is power, is money, is sex, is pleasure, is self-glorification, then it is a bad character. And so character is behind everything. I mean, I don't know, I can never remember these people's names in the business world, but they used to say that, and I would say that character eats all other things for breakfast before anything else, before we talk about culture, before we talk about policies, procedures, rules, guidelines. Character matters more than anything else. And that's why we wrote that sentence that you quoted And then the other side of that is churches tend to hire on the basis of performance, partly because performance matters on Sunday morning. If that person can get up on that platform and entertain me for 30 or 45 minutes and nurture me and motivate me and help me change and help other people change and get people saved, if that sort of thing is happening, you hire them, but you don't have any idea what they're like behind closed doors. And that's part of the reason we emphasize performance over character. The other part of it is we have a culture and a history of churches that have not emphasized character so much that we don't even have skills in detecting character. So, John, I started doing this in interviews on Tove, and I've done about 250 of them. I talk about hiring and search process, and I tell them that for every lawyer on your search team, you have to have 2 psychologists. And it really wasn't a comment about lawyers so much as it is the need for having people on a search committee with psychology skills to detect character in a person. Because psychologists are trained and have learned by talking with people over the years, they are trained to detect bad character. And so they'll be able to say, that guy or that woman, they don't have it. You better not hire that person. They're narcissists. And psychologists can pick it up every time. So it's just one of the symptoms, I think, that we have. But we do not focus on character, and therefore we don't hire on the basis of character.
So let me ask a little bit of a different question, because in my context and for many in the audience for this podcast, Unpolished Church, we talk about smaller expressions of church. We try to figure out ways to create environments that help to shrink that gap between the stage and the spectators, to try to shrink the gap between the way that power is distributed, etc. And you mentioned in the book Pivot, you say that power is the single biggest temptation for those swept up into a vision of something better, which of course I think most people would say we want a vision of something better. We want to be swept up into a vision of something better. But one potent way to break down that temptation is to constantly work at sharing power with others. And in our modality, we're trying to create environments that can help be conducive for this shared power and this greater equality of the priesthood of all believers, rather than, a larger divide between clergy, laity, and these kinds of things. The people who entertain and the people who spectate. We've talked a lot about those dynamics here on this podcast. Maybe you can share a little bit about that as you think about what it looks like to develop Tove character and cultures as individuals and in community, perhaps in a different modality than the traditional church structure where 80-90% of the people are spectating, 10 to 20% of the people who are producing religious goods and services, typically one day a week. If we're gonna look at the expression of our faith in community through a different lens, through a different modality of trying to envision us really partnering, covenanting, walking with other people in real life, and not so much of this performance, how does Tove fit into that? What things come to your mind in terms of how you would counsel or advise a community of believers to try to adopt these Tove principles, both, again, individually, of course, through their own character and becoming more into the likeness of Jesus, but also collectively? What types of things come to your mind?
Yeah, John, one of the major issues is the structures that are in place in our culture, in churches, in church history, in our brains of what we expect church to be. If people have gone to church at all in their life, most of them have gone and are aware that there's a person up front who seems to be running everything. And I don't mean this in a negative way, is that we've developed a leader in every group, people who have, let's say, the gift of leadership are going to rise to the surface. And I always tell people it takes about a month and that you're going to recognize who the leaders are. It might not take that long. The issue is what happens in a church that recognizes that someone, let's say, has the gifts of leadership. What has happened over time is a virtual surrender of power, responsibility, and resources to that person or to a small group of persons, and everybody else then becomes, you called it spectating. And I think there's something about that, is that they say, okay, I've handed my responsibility, the responsibility for running the show, to this person or to this group of people, and therefore I'll come and enjoy it, and they do things that I enjoy, and therefore I give them money, and that props up their support. That's the way we've done things. And what happens with certain kinds of personalities, particularly those who are higher on the scale of narcissism, and everybody who wants to get on a platform is on the scale, is on the spectrum, as Chuck DeGroat has said. He said, Scott, we're on it as well. We're professors. We get up and we tell people what the Bible says. He says only people who are on that spectrum are going to say things like this. So we grant this leadership, but then before long, leadership can become intoxicating. It can become toxic, and it can become infectious in the community, because then this person is so good and this person is making money and this person needs to make that money because this is how their family exists. And before long, there becomes a codependent relationship. You provide for me what I want, and I'll provide the money so that you can provide for me what I want. And this is not at all what was going on in the early church. So one of the things that I believe is that we need to learn to share power, even if it means that we have people who are paid and have learned to share the power, or if it means we pay more people and no one person as much. I'm all for the attempting what needs to be done in order to distribute power in the community so that each person has agency to carry out the gifts that God has given them to do.
I think of Jesus' words, right, where he upends the paradigms of leadership and power when he says that, the rulers of the Gentiles lord over and use power in a certain way and through a certain vestige. And you are not to be like that, right? And in my kingdom, those who would wield power actually do so through self-sacrifice, through the powerlessness of enslaving themselves. And obviously this is most visible through Jesus' death on the cross, and his vindication through the resurrection. So
there's a good book about this that I've just returned to, and I've been writing about because I'm writing a little book on Jesus and women with Lucy Pepiot, who's a United Kingdom scholar in theology. There's a book by John N. Collins, called Diakonia, in which he proves that the word diakoneo, which we translate serve or minister, and diakonia, service or ministry.
And this is this just for most of my audience who has no history in Greek. This is the word that's translated deacon in English most typically.
That's right. Yeah. And in fact, I play
because no one listening, Dr. McKnight, will know what you're talking about.
Deaconing. I talk about deaconing in this book. He's demonstrated that this word derives from the idea of a mission, and that a person is sent or commissioned by God. In this case, Jesus was commissioned by God in Mark 10:35-45, which is the text you were talking about. And the sense is that the person who is serving the one who sent them, not the ones to whom they are sent. Now, this makes a big difference. The word servant in the New Testament does not mean menial tasks. It means, let's say, a mediator between the one who sent us and what we do for those to whom we have been sent. The word diakonia and diakoneo then is more connected to the Greek word apostello or apostolos or apostle than it is to slavery, doulos, douleo, although these words can overlap. So there is a sense at times in when the word diakoneo means to wait on tables. But it is not about menial service. It is about being commissioned to do something. And so I think this is empowering, John, in a local church. When people in the church realize that what they're doing is what God has called them to do, and the church props up their calling or their giftedness, rather than someone, servant leadership. I got to tell you, servant leadership for me is a fool's game in the sense that most of the people who talk about servant leadership are in charge of everything in a church. And they go serve in a homeless kitchen, and then they act like they're being servants. But most of the time, people are running around doing whatever they want, and they have all kinds of power and authority. And then they're talking about servant leadership. So I get nervous about that idea. And there's something really powerful about it. But let us refocus our energies on the fact that the one we're serving is God, not other people.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden we are all empowered because God has commissioned us to minister to others,
right?
Rather than, so I call it deaconing. Deaconing is not, in the New Testament, deacons are, let's say, lower on the hierarchy of ministry in a church, but they're ministering, they're serving God by carrying out tasks that God has called them to do.
I know in our local context here, one of the things we've been talking about a lot recently in our microchurch expressions is this priesthood of all believer paradigm. And for every individual Christian to seek to listen to what Jesus' call is on their life and how he is inviting them to partner with him in mission in some way in the world, rather than, again, just kind of abdicating, okay, pastor, CEO, you tell us what God is calling you to do, and then we're all just going to kind of like try to participate in some way to make your vision happen. And it has been interesting for us to witness the transition of like kind of reimagining that as a community, because you can understand how difficult it is for each of us to take on that ownership, responsibility, that participation with Jesus to be ministering to the world around us, right? To be his ambassadors, rather than just the select few maybe that are vocationally supported to do those things. And it's been really encouraging and refreshing and also eye-opening. And, and also it changes people's perceptions, because obviously the vast majority of any Christian demographic in our context is going to have come from this traditional expression. They're asking me, so if I'm going to be deaconing in the world, if I'm going to be partnering with Jesus' mission in the world, what are we paying you to do? And why are you supported vocationally, since you're not performing the goods and services on Sunday as we're accustomed to? And so I was curious as to if you might have a comment on that, and if there was something that came to your mind as you think about this, call for all of us to be this priesthood of believers, that all of us are called to be priests and representatives and ambassadors for Jesus in the world around us.
I get tripped up a little bit. I totally agree with what you're saying. But it was Martin Luther, who got into the priesthood of all believers. And I think he tripped up because he wanted everybody to be a priest, because that was the Roman Catholic sense of hierarchy in the day, which is a sharing of ministry. So what is a priest? A priest is someone who mediates between God and the people and God. That's exactly what diakonia, the word deacon, had in the ancient world, according to John N. Collins. But But Luther, I think, made the mistake of calling it priesthood. And I think the way you've just described it is exactly what the New Testament teaches. And that is that we each have a ministry in this world to mediate the grace of God to another person on the basis of the calling that we have received. So we become mediators. In that sense, we're all priests, mediating the work of God. I really like the idea of shared ministry. Each person, according to their own giftedness and calling, exercising their gifts in the context of the community for other people to do whatever God has called them to do. And I think in this way, power is disrupted and power becomes distributed. When power is vested in a single person, it is a zero-sum game. When power is invested in all, power is unlimited. And the danger, of course, is vesting all that power in a single person or a couple people, and everybody looks to them for every decision made, and they look for them for approval. And the next thing you know, you have a toxic system where people are not exercising the mediatorial gifts that God has given to them.
Right.
They're waiting for the pastor to do it.
Right. So where I think I want to go now is to pivot a little bit. You see what I did there?
That's
We're going to pivot into another subject matter that you have written about and that you talk extensively about, and that is this idea of Jesus's understanding, relationship, utilization of power, and how that was upended by his life and ministry, and obviously his followers stumbling as best they could to imitate that as he waged conflict against toxic power by emptying himself. I'm thinking of Paul's words in particular in Philippians 2, right? That though he had equality with God, it wasn't used to his advantage. It was emptied. And so it was this new way of understanding and utilizing power. And in particular, and this is obviously the subject of some of my specific work, that has direct correlation to violence. And the fact that Jesus didn't employ violence to accomplish his ends and his goals. And he didn't utilize power in violent means to exercise his authority. And yet he has all authority. And so there's this really paradoxical connection and relationship with power that Jesus has. And you talk about in a book that was released at the same time as Pivot, the Bible is not enough in terms of imagination and making peace in a modern context, in a modern world. And so I'd love to maybe dive into that subject matter for a moment, if you wouldn't mind, and to ask, as you understand Jesus and as you understand Jesus' relationship with power, his imaginative ability to, make peace through means that no one else seems to be able to make peace through. What kind of things come to your mind when you think about what it looks like for us as Jesus followers today to use our imaginations in making peace?
Yeah, that title was a clever title by my publisher, but we got a few of my friends a little irritated. The Bible is not enough. And what
I would imagine.
What we mean by that is when you and I look into our world today with a military buildup that is capable of blowing the world up, when we have volatile leaders in the world like Putin, Zelensky, Trump, Netanyahu, Hamas leaders, we are seeing the grotesqueness of humans who want control and power and glory and honor, and who have sufficient egos that they cannot surrender. The secret to Jesus was that he had all power and he used his power for the good and redemptive purposes of others. The danger of power is accumulation and aggrandizement, so that people gather power in order to build themselves up. And that's what Jesus was fighting against in Mark chapter 10. And when it says in Philippians chapter 2 that he emptied himself, kanao is the Greek word, it doesn't mean that he surrendered everything, but he chose not to use power for his own benefit and for his own glory. He chose to use that power, and he became human in order to bring humans into the presence of God. So it's not about not having power. We have power. The question is how we use power, and power is to be used for the redemption of other people. And that's how Jesus used it. And this is a major calling for Christians in our world today, when it is easy to get drawn into political battles as to whether our partisan, our party, our partisanship wins and the other one loses. It's a zero-sum game. It actually isn't. And that is Christians being drawn into a political process that is the very opposite of what Jesus was doing. And it's not that I think you should say to your neighbor, who do you want to be president? I'll vote for you. I'll vote for you, and therefore surrender my vote for someone else. The point is, we want to do what's right, but at the same time, we don't want to do it so that we can have power, but so that the redemptive purposes of God can be achieved maximally in our world. And
perhaps another way of saying that is our vote as Christians, if we are going to engage in that civic parameter, should not be done selfishly as its primary motive. Is that another way of saying what you're saying?
Yes, I think it is. Voting basically works by saying to every individual citizen, it's the way I think it's designed, is something like this: what's best for you is best for the most, if everybody chooses what is best for themselves. That's a good idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, because how it works is that we then become engaged in competition for power. I grew up being taught that that one party, now I got to tell you, this is the way it was framed for me, so this is going to sound political, is that Republicans believe that what's best for me is best for the most, and Democrats believe what's best for the most is what's best for me. Now, that's pretty simplistic, and it's not accurate. But there is something about thinking about what's best for our nation as more important than what's best for me, unless I'm a person without power. Let's say I'm a person of color, or let's say I'm a person whose grandfather crossed the line in California, either legally or illegally, and that I am an entirely legitimate citizen in the United States, born here, and now all of a sudden I'm threatened. Then I think I'm going to be thinking about myself, of what's best for me in this situation will be best for millions in the United States, and I'm going to side with them. That becomes an exercise of surrendering power for the good of what's, a just cause. So I think we have to be careful, but I do think that voting is a tricky thing, and it's very difficult for it not to become selfish. And we have to do what we can. I like to say, vote for the candidate that you think will be most conducive to the to the work of the kingdom of God as taught by Jesus. And
so in such, it is ultimately kind of a lesser of two evils type of situation.
It is. And voting, I think that's the only voting works.
And to not think of it in such a way is setting yourself up for disappointment or worse from the beginning, right? And I think as I have taught and preached about the civic engagement from a Christian perspective, I don't come from, nor am I in a particularly Anabaptist or sort of separatist heritage, but I can see some of the value and the inklings of those kinds of ideas. And so as I have taught for years now about civic engagement from a Christian perspective, because we've pivoted once again here at this point in the conversation, but it's impossible to overlay one for one the first century Roman context in which the New Testament was written into our 21st century democratic republic context. They're just not the same things. And it's very tricky, as you said, to apply these principles and these realities of the kingdom revealed to us through the scriptures into our context and contextualize the kingdom of Jesus when we do have certain abilities and powers and opportunities for influence that perhaps other cultures didn't then, and many still do not now. And so how do we utilize that in a way that's responsible and consistent with the ethic of Jesus' kingdom, i.e., not voting or engaging civically only for a selfish use of power or a selfish benefit, but at the same time not abdicating completely and saying, just hogwash with the whole thing. We're just going to go build a few homes in some caves and try to separate ourselves from this kingdom of the world. And I do find that there's great tension there. And so as we have now pivoted thrice times from your original Tove work that we started on, what advice might you give to a conscientious Jesus follower who finds themselves in the political landscape of our current American context? What advice would you give them as they consider these things of how do I utilize whatever power, whatever privilege, whatever opportunity I have been given from God for the benefit of others, right? And there's going to be a scale there, of course, right? Like you and I probably have in our context a much greater degree of power and privilege and innate influence than maybe some others do. But no matter where you're at on that scale, how do we each look at it in a way that is consistent with the ethic of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, that's a massive question. I think the early church was right when Paul and Peter talked about praying for those who lead. Okay, Peter especially. A second thing is to take the angle that our responsibility is, let's say, the mission of the kingdom in this world, and to keep that uppermost and foremost in our view as we move forward in what we're doing. The third thing I would say is we need to concentrate on our own character and our own, let's say, innermost being in looking at these things. Am I being sucked into this political process in a way that is making me, is hurting my character?
Unlike Jesus.
Is it distorting me as what God has called me to do? And then to live peaceably with the results while resisting against injustices. So, for instance, there'll be a lot of Republicans today who were happy because Donald Trump won. Okay, I can live with that because there's a lot of Republicans in the United States. But if those Christians are so committed to the political party that they can't see the injustices of a president who is clearly violating law and is being blocked daily by courts for performing things that are illegal, and that he doesn't care. Russell Vogt, who was behind Project 2025, basically said that the president, the laws are so corrupt in this nation that the president will have to resist the courts. Well, we do not have, this is contrary to the balancing of powers in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of our government. And this is contrary to the way presidents are supposed to behave and the way our government's supposed to work. So if we have Christians who are unwilling, even if they support a certain candidate and a president, unwilling to offer friendly fire, to use a military image, if they're unwilling to speak words of prophetic protest against injustices, then their politics have become idolatrous, that they are more important. Their political power is more important than doing what Jesus has called us to do. So those would be the fundamental principles that I would say we need to have today. In 1970s, when I first began to vote, it wasn't the same. It's a different world that we live in right now. And I think Christians who are not protesting the injustices of the current administration have become complicit in behaviors and habits that can destroy a perfectly wonderful country.
Well, that could be taken a couple different ways, though, right? Like, I mean, couldn't someone argue that while, yes, there may be corruption, as we mentioned earlier, the lesser of evils type of thing, there can be corruption and injustices over here, but isn't there also something that's redemptive and congruent with the purposes of Jesus' kingdom over here, let's say in some other policy or legislative agenda towards, trying to protect unborn life or whatever? Like, I think what I'm trying to ask and to see what you think about this more rounded perspective, that no matter who is in office, no matter what partisan politic you find yourself aligning with, there's always going to be some level of congruency with the kingdom of God and incongruency with the kingdom of God. And
Totally.
you're trying to weigh the lesser of all evils. And I can hear someone, right, who's listening to you going, oh, well, what about, Trump doing these things or helping, or this political party or ideology that isn't, while, yes, I think obviously you're making great points in terms of these things over here are incongruent, but is that escapable? And if not, then what do you do?
Whataboutism is not political wisdom. That is, what about Trump being against abortion? First of all, I don't think he is, but that's the way he operates in order to get what he wants. But what about does not do anything but seek to divert the discussion away from something that is important? So, for instance, let's just say that what Trump is doing in sending people to foreign countries illegally, according to our law. Let's talk about that. Let's not say then, well, what about he's doing this good? See, that's a defense of a political candidate rather than a discernment of a moral issue from a Christian standpoint. We can affirm what is good while at the same time protesting against what is bad or unjust. And what is good does not gainsay, does not cause us to leave the conversation about what is bad. So the whataboutism, you see this in all kinds of things.
So, but how would you?
So I see this with pastors
in terms of prioritization, right? Like, I totally track with what you're saying. Like, let's say someone, often referred to as like single issue voting or something like that, like where there's a prioritization of these are the greatest moral principles that I want to, project or to apply whatever power and influence I have, a la my vote, right? Like protecting unborn children is, since I'm having to choose the lesser of all evils, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here with you.
Yeah, I know.
Like,
but
how would you respond to someone who's trying to prioritize choosing a lesser of all evils type of situation?
Well, they have to choose what they think is lesser of all evils. But I would not reduce this to voting. Once the vote is over, it's over. So now it is 4 years with the president, and are we willing to critique what is unjust and to support what is just? I know most Americans are unwilling to offer critical words about the president that they voted for, and they're willing to offer critical words of the the candidate they didn't vote for. The question is whether we have sufficient moral critical thinking skills to be able to say, I like this about this candidate and I dislike this about that candidate, so that it is not a single issue voting might lead to someone on a voting. But now we have a president, and we had this with Obama. Let's say, go back to Reagan. We can go back to Bush. We can go back to Obama. We can go back to Biden. Once they're in office, then we as Christians are called to exercise moral discernment on what we stand with and what we stand against. So single issue will not do it. We might be committed to a single issue more than anything else, but I think overall we have to do what is right according to, let's say, the kingdom vision of Jesus, and fight for those things that are just and resist those things that are unjust. And I think in the long run, the church's witness will be better when Christians do not align themselves with a political party, but instead align themselves with the kingdom vision of Jesus and speak from that platform.
Well said. Let me ask another follow-up question. What would you say to the person who decides, I don't want to choose the lesser of all evils. I'm going to abstain from this particular platform of voting or influencing my power. And instead, I'm going to try to embody and uphold these kingdom values in my life, my community, but I'm not going to vote. How would you respond to that sort of Christian narrative?
The position of people not wanting to vote?
Yeah, the person who says, I'm going to choose not to vote because I don't want to have to decipher, or I don't believe I can discern in a wise way the choosing of lesser of evils.
I think
so. Therefore, I'm going to try to embody the kingdom ethic that I desire personally and in the community to the best of the ability that I have, while abstaining from this civic power that I have been allotted.
I think that's an entirely legitimate Christian position. And I applaud people who work themselves, thinking wise, into a position like that, because I think it's a respectable Christian position. As long as that doesn't mean that they've absolved themselves from all civic responsibilities because they haven't voted. We have a responsibility beyond the vote for 4 years of moral discernment. And I think that's the critical issue. How do we live? And I think that we should embody, I've written about this in so many places. I believe the fundamental place for the Christian witness is the church, the local church. I don't care how you define it. I don't know anything about micro churches, but that's where churches embody the kingdom of God and witness, therefore, to an alternative arrangement in this world.
That's right. An alternative.
Out of that witness, they can participate in the community, in the civic responsibilities, in whatever federal, etc., state. But the fundamental thing is to embody the kingdom ethics ourselves and to embody that in our community as a witness to the gospel, and to live out of that and so witness to the gospel rather than to political party.
Sorry. Yes. No, you're great. So yes, ultimately, however we navigate, our allegiance is to Christ and his kingdom first and foremost, above any polis of the world. Right.
Yeah.
And this is that famous Anabaptist vision, right? That this two kingdom theology that has been so persuasive to me in my journey, and obviously has led me to places like nonviolence and pacifism and a certain view of civic engagement. But Scot, down here in the South, Dr. McKnight, it's been such a joy to have you. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to many more productive and fruitful conversations in the future. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, John. Good to be with you and fun conversation.
Yes. Tov to you and your household.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.